The scent of lilac perfume still lingers in my memory, cloying and sharp drifting through my kitchen, on a night when it had no business being there. I had walked in after a late parent meeting, papers in my arms, only to hear the low hum of voices upstairs. Mark's voice, warm and coaxing, followed by the sound of a laugh I knew too well, but had no reason to hear in my own home. It wasn't Lily's laughter, nor the voice of a relative dropping by. It was Tessa's, my oldest friend, my supposed confidant, her perfume saturating the air like an uninvited guest. That night, I stood frozen by the staircase, my heart pounding in my ears, the fragile foundation of my life trembling under the weight of a single sound. Before I go any further, let me know in the comments where you're listening from, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more true family stories of betrayal and justice. My name is Elena Brooks, and I have always believed in steady ground. At 46, I had built my life on quiet devotion, my work as a school counselor, my role as a mother, and my marriage to Mark, who seemed for years to be my anchor. We met in our 20s, me still working on my master's degree, him already climbing the ranks of a regional sales company. He was charming in a way that turned heads at every gathering, while I offered the kind of reliability that people leaned on. Together, we made sense, or at least, I thought we did. Family meant everything to me. My parents had raised me with the belief that love was work, that loyalty was not optional, and that respect was the bedrock of any lasting union. I carried those lessons into my marriage, often bending to keep the peace, smoothing over arguments before they had time to grow sharp. Mark and I built our home in a quiet neighborhood, a place where our daughter Lily could grow up safe. For years, life seemed good. We had dinners around the table, summer vacations by the coast, holidays at Walter's house, where Mark played the dutiful son and I, the dependable daughter-in-law. Tessa was part of that picture too. She had been in my life since college, a woman with quick wit and impeccable style. When she started her own event planning business, I was one of her first loyal clients, and later, when Mark's company needed someone for conferences, I recommended her. She was in and out of our lives so often that her presence became as natural as family. I trusted her with secrets, leaned on her advice, and welcomed her into spaces most people never reached. She was supposed to be my sister in all but name. Looking back, there were moments that might have warned me subtle things I brushed aside. A glance between them that lasted a beat too long at a dinner party, a joke they shared that left me feeling oddly on the outside, a text from Tessa late at night that she claimed was about business. But at the time, I refused to believe malice could live in people I loved so dearly. I told myself I was being oversensitive, that friendship and marriage sometimes overlap in strange ways. I chose trust because I thought trust was strength. Mark thrived in the spotlight both at work and at home. His company relied on his charm, his ability to close deals and win people over, and I admired that about him. Meanwhile, I lived in the quieter corners, listening to students pour out their struggles, helping Lily navigate the chaos of adolescence, holding the household together. We balanced each other, or so it seemed, one shining brightly while the other steadied the ground beneath. I believed that was love's design. But there are fractures that hide deep within the walls, invisible, until the weight above grows too heavy. That night, standing by the staircase with lilac perfume searing my senses, I realized that my home was not the safe haven I thought it was. Something was breaking quietly but unmistakably, and no amount of smoothing over could stop it. I hadn't confronted them yet. I hadn't made a sound. I simply stood there, clutching my papers, the truth pressing in on me from every side. What I didn't know then was that the crack I had discovered was only the beginning, that the betrayal would deepen, spreading through every corner of my life, until silence was no longer an option. The next morning, I moved through the house in silence, though every object seemed to echo with meaning it had never held before. Mark left early for work, humming as if nothing had shifted while the faint trace of perfume clung to the stairwell. I stood in the kitchen holding my coffee, my hand trembling just enough that I had to set the cup down. Lily was running late for school, rushing around with a backpack half unzipped, and I forced my face into calmness. I didn't want her to sense the crack forming, not yet. At school, the rhythm of my day usually carried me, but that morning, it was harder. I listened to a student recount an argument with her mother, nodding at the right places. Yet part of me felt far away. When my colleague Denise stopped me in the hall, her sharp eyes caught what I thought I'd hidden. "You look pale," she said softly. Rough night, I almost told her everything right then, how I had stood on the stairs listening to laughter that didn't belong in my home. Instead, I smiled faintly and murmured something about grading papers too late. She let it go, but the kindness in her gaze followed me the rest of the day. That evening, Mark came home cheerful, a bag of takeout in his hands, acting like he'd done me some grand favor. He kissed my cheek too casually and asked about Lily's day. I watched him laugh with her across the table, leaning back in his chair like a man without a care. Tessa's perfume drifted through my memory, and I had to steady my fork before I snapped it in half. Every detail of his ease grated against the knowledge I carried, though I said nothing. Silence had always been my default, but now it pressed against me like a weight. The first visible crack came a few days later at Walter's house. He had invited us for Sunday dinner, something he tried to do at least once a month since his wife passed. Tessa was there too, arriving with a tray of her famous lemon bars, hugging Walter warmly, her laugh filling the kitchen. I felt my chest tighten when I saw Mark's face brighten as she walked in. Their eyes met for a beat too long, and though it could have passed as friendship, I knew better now. During dinner, Lily chattered about her college applications, and I forced myself to stay engaged, asking questions, smiling at the right moments. Yet I couldn't ignore how often Mark and Tessa's conversation ran parallel to the rest of us. She teased him about his clumsy golf swing, and he leaned in grinning like a boy. My fork hovered over my plate as I caught the subtle brush of her hand against his arm, so small, most people would have missed it. Walter didn't notice, too busy telling a story from his construction days, but to me, it was glaring. On the drive home, I gripped the steering wheel while Mark scrolled through his phone beside me. Lily was dozing in the back seat, her head against the window. "You seemed quiet tonight," he remarked casually without looking up. My throat burned with words I longed to say, but I only muttered, "Just tired." He nodded distracted and went back to his messages. That dismissal sealed the feeling that I was standing on the outside of my own marriage, watching the walls lean away from me. I started noticing patterns after that. Tessa appeared at events she had no reason to attend, like the Booster Club fundraiser at Lily's school. She worked the room with her usual confidence, but her eyes found Mark too quickly, too often. He excused himself from conversations just to stand near her, and I caught them once leaning in close, their voices low, their smiles private. Denise, who was helping at the raffle table, glanced at me with a question in her eyes, but I turned away before she could ask. Admitting the truth would make it real, and I wasn't ready for that. At home, the tension thickened in ways Lily began to sense. One evening, she asked Mom, "Are you and Dad okay?" "You don't laugh at his jokes anymore." Her voice was hesitant, as though she was afraid of the answer. I kissed her forehead and told her everything was fine, that grown-ups had busy minds. She nodded, but the doubt lingered in her eyes. Protecting her had always been my first instinct, yet I couldn't shield her from what seeped through the cracks. Mark grew bolder with time, his carelessness cutting me deeper than his secrecy. One night, he left his phone on the counter while he showered. A message lit the screen, Tessa's name followed by a string of hearts. My breath caught my hands stiff at my sides. I didn't open it, though the temptation clawed at me. Instead, I stood there, staring at the glowing screen until it dimmed again, the proof of what I feared carved into my mind. The silence between us became more noticeable. At dinner, conversations that once flowed now stumbled. He spent more evenings out claiming late meetings or catching drinks with colleagues, while I sat alone with the dishes listening to the clock tick. When he did sit across from me, he scrolled through his phone under the table, offering half answers when I spoke. It was as though I had become background noise in my own home. I began keeping track, a quiet ledger only I could see. Times he left excuses, he gave the faint smell of perfume that followed him in. I folded each observation into myself, not yet a confrontation, but a growing archive. I knew that to accuse without proof would only invite denial, maybe even turn the story against me. So I stayed still, outwardly composed, while inside I braced for the collapse I could feel coming. The night that shifted everything was the gala. Mark had been talking about it for weeks, a corporate affair meant to impress clients and strengthen ties. He insisted I come, and I agreed, determined to watch with clear eyes. When we walked into the ballroom, I saw her almost immediately. Tessa dressed in a shimmering gown, her smile too radiant when it found him. She crossed the room like she belonged to his side, and he met her halfway, leaving me standing with a glass of champagne I no longer wanted. I kept my composure, my smile polite, as introductions swirled around us, but my gaze never left the two of them. They spoke as though sharing a secret, their bodies angled toward each other, even in a crowd. The sight pressed the air from my lungs, yet no one else seemed to notice. To everyone else, it was just laughter, just conversation, just friends. But I knew better, and the weight of it settled deep in my chest. That night, when we returned home, Mark tossed his jacket on the chair and poured himself a drink as though nothing had happened. I went upstairs, sat on the edge of the bed, and stared at the floor until my eyes blurred. The crack was no longer hidden. It had split wide open, and the silence I had carried was no longer enough to contain it. What I didn't realize then was that this was only the beginning, that the small betrayals I had witnessed would soon unravel into something I could never again deny. The foundation of my life was shifting, and soon it would all come crashing down. Nights became the hardest. I would lie awake listening to the faint hum of Mark's breathing beside me, steady and untroubled, while my chest felt like a vice tightening around every beat of my heart. In the quiet, my mind replayed moments I wished I could forget: the sound of laughter on the stairs, the brush of Tessa's hand on his arm, the glowing screen with her name followed by hearts. The more I tried to push those memories aside, the sharper they returned, leaving me exhausted before morning even began. At work, I did what I always had showed up for. My students listened to their fears and offered steady guidance. Yet there was a hollowness under my voice, a weight I couldn't quite conceal. Denise noticed first. One afternoon, she leaned against my office door, her expression gentle. "You've been carrying something," she said quietly. For a long moment, I considered brushing it off, but the words caught in my throat. "It's Mark." I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. She stepped inside, closed the door, and sat across from me. "Tell me," she urged, and for the first time, I let the truth spill out. Denise listened without interruption as I recounted the perfume, the texts, the lingering looks. By the time I finished, her face was a mixture of sorrow and disbelief. "Elena, you can't keep this inside," she said firmly. "It'll eat you alive." I nodded, though tears pricked at my eyes. I don't want to tear my family apart without proof, I confessed. And Lily, she deserves stability, not chaos. Denise reached for my hand, squeezed it gently, and said, "Protecting her doesn't mean burying yourself." Her words stayed with me long after she left. At home, the walls felt thinner, every sound amplified. Mark would scroll through his phone at the dinner table, smiling faintly at messages he never shared. I watched him across the flicker of candlelight, feeling as though I were staring at a stranger who still wore my husband's face. Lily tried to fill the silence, talking about her college essay drafts, and I forced myself to stay present for her sake. But beneath the surface, my thoughts churned. I wondered how long it would be before she noticed the shift, before she realized that her parents no longer moved in unison. The weekends became unbearable. Mark found excuses to be gone golf with clients' errands that stretched into hours. When he was home, he seemed distracted, his attention drifting toward his phone or an unexplained call. Once he stepped into the backyard to take a conversation. His voice low, but when I opened the kitchen window, I caught the lilt of his laughter, light and familiar. My stomach twisted, knowing without hearing the name that it was her. I began keeping small notes to myself. Dates, times, the places he claimed to be, the faint perfume that trailed him. It was a quiet act of survival, something that gave shape to the unease that threatened to consume me. Each entry felt like another stone placed on a scale, tipping slowly toward the truth I had yet to confront. One evening, after Mark claimed he had to work late, I drove past his office on my way home from the grocery store. The building was dark, the parking lot nearly empty. My heart pounded as I circled back, my palms damp against the steering wheel. I parked a few blocks away and sat in the silence, waiting, though I wasn't sure what I expected to see. After half an hour, his car pulled past me, headlights catching my face in the mirror. He wasn't alone. Tessa sat in the passenger seat, her profile illuminated by the dashboard lights, her hand resting casually on her lap, as if it belonged there. My breath caught, but I didn't follow. Instead, I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles whitened and whispered to myself, "So this is what it is now." Back at home, I unloaded groceries with trembling hands, setting the milk too hard on the counter. Lily wandered in earbuds around her neck and gave me a curious look. "You okay, Mom?" she asked. I forced a smile, brushing her hair back. "Just tired, sweetheart," I said. She seemed unconvinced but didn't press. I kissed her forehead, then retreated to my room where the silence pressed down like a weight I couldn't escape. Mark returned later, carrying the faint scent of wine and laughter. He kissed me lightly as if nothing were amiss and settled into bed. I lay rigid beside him, staring at the ceiling, wondering how long he believed this charade could last. My chest ached with the effort of staying quiet, yet I couldn't bring myself to shatter the fragile illusion, not yet. In the days that followed, I noticed small changes in Lily. She lingered in her room more often, her laughter quieter, her questions fewer. Once, I caught her studying me at dinner, her fork paused halfway to her mouth. "You and Dad don't talk like you used to," she said softly. I froze, searching for the right words. "Sometimes marriages go through quiet spells," I answered, trying to sound steady. She nodded, but looked down at her plate, and my heart broke at the thought of her carrying the weight of my silence. I turned back to Denise, needing her strength. Over coffee at a quiet cafe, I confessed what I had seen that night in the car. Her face tightened, her voice firm. "Elena, this isn't suspicion anymore. This is betrayal." I stirred my cup slowly, the steam blurring my vision. "I know," I whispered, "but knowing and accepting aren't the same." She reached across the table, her hand covering mine. "Then take your time," she said gently, "but don't let him write the story for you. At home, I began withdrawing, not out of weakness, but out of preservation. I stopped waiting for him to come home, stopped asking where he'd been. I focused on Lily, on my students, on the small tasks that steadied me. Yet, beneath the surface, I was unraveling. Nights stretched into long hours of staring at the ceiling, my body heavy with exhaustion, but my mind relentless. Tears came silently soaking into the pillow where no one could see. The house itself felt altered. Rooms that once held warmth now carried shadows. The kitchen, once a place of laughter and shared meals, echoed with silence. The bedroom, once a refuge, became a stage where I played the role of a wife too tired to talk. Everywhere I turned, I felt the absence of what once had been. It was in those quiet hours when the house was still that the truth settled fully into me. The life I had built with Mark was no longer what I thought it was. The betrayal wasn't just in his actions, but in the erosion of trust, in the way he had allowed me to believe in something false. The weight of that realization pressed against me until it was hard to breathe. I hadn't confronted him yet. I hadn't spoken the words aloud. But inside me, something had shifted. The pain was no longer a sharp wound, but a steady ache, a constant reminder that the life I once trusted was slipping away. And deep down, I knew the silence couldn't hold forever, that soon the truth would demand a voice. The weight of silence had become unbearable. Each night I lay awake, the truth clawing at me, the air in my own home heavy with something I could no longer deny. The small cracks had widened into deep fractures, and I realized I had been clinging to the hope that this was just a passing shadow. But shadows don't linger this long unless something is standing in the light, and I could no longer turn my face away. One morning, I caught myself studying Mark across the breakfast table. His tie knotted neatly, his phone already buzzing with messages he pretended not to notice. He was speaking to Lily about her senior project, his voice light and easy, but I felt the hollowness of it. His eyes flicked toward the screen every few seconds, and I didn't need to see the name flashing to know who it was. I set my coffee down carefully, steadying my hand against the table, and in that moment, I understood the marriage I thought I had was already gone. That day at school, I sat with Denise during our lunch break, the words spilling out before I could stop them. "It's over," I whispered, and she looked at me sharply. "You've decided?" she asked. I nodded, though the decision burned in my chest. I can't keep living like this, waiting for proof while drowning in silence. It doesn't matter if he admits it. What matters is that I see it clearly now. Denise reached across the table, squeezing my hand. "Then start preparing yourself," she said gently. Quietly, carefully, but don't ignore what your heart already knows. At home, I began to notice the small ways my detachment unsettled Mark. I stopped asking about his late nights or his sudden errands. I stopped filling the silence with questions he'd only dodge. Instead, I listened, I observed, and I stored away every detail with a calmness he didn't recognize. He seemed almost relieved at first, mistaking my quiet for acceptance, but then suspicion crept into his eyes. He'd ask why I was so distant, why I didn't laugh at his stories. I answered with a smile too faint to hold meaning, and his unease grew. The turning point came one Saturday afternoon when Tessa stopped by unannounced. She breezed into my kitchen with a bottle of wine and a practiced smile, saying she just happened to be in the neighborhood. Her perfume struck me before her words did the same cloying scent that had haunted my stairwell weeks earlier. Mark appeared from the backyard moments later, his expression tightening before he forced it into charm. "Well, this is a surprise," he said, though the way their eyes met spoke otherwise. We sat at the table, the three of us, while Lily studied upstairs. Tessa filled the space with chatter about an upcoming event. Her hands animated, her eyes flicking toward Mark too often. I watched quietly, my face composed, but inside something hardened. I wasn't imagining this, and I wasn't mistaken. Their betrayal lived in every stolen glance, every too smooth explanation, and I finally allowed myself to see it for what it was. That night, I stood at the bathroom mirror long after Mark had fallen asleep. My reflection stared back, tired but steady, and I realized I had crossed a line within myself. I could no longer pretend this was doubt. It was truth, sharp and unyielding. My heart ached, yes, but there was also a new strength rising beneath the ache, something that felt like resolve. The next day, I visited Walter under the pretense of bringing him groceries. He welcomed me in, grateful as always, but I could see the concern in his eyes. "You're thinner," he said softly. "Are you eating?" I brushed off his worry, but I knew he saw more than I wanted to admit. We sat at his kitchen table, and though I didn't tell him everything, I asked questions about resilience, about what he had learned in the years since losing his wife. His words were simple but grounding. When something's broken beyond repair, you don't patch it with tape. You rebuild. Driving home, I carried those words like a lantern through the fog. I wasn't ready to confront Mark outright, not yet, but I had stopped lying to myself. The marriage I thought I had no longer existed, and the life I wanted would never be possible if I stayed in its ruins. That evening, as I cleared the dinner dishes, Mark stood by the sink scrolling through his phone. His face lit briefly with a smile before he caught my gaze and quickly tucked it away. For the first time, I didn't feel the familiar pang of heartbreak. Instead, I felt a strange steadiness, as though the ground beneath me had shifted, but I was finally finding my footing. I spent the rest of that week moving with quiet purpose. I organized documents, checked bank accounts, and began noting the patterns of his absences with greater precision. It wasn't a plan yet, not fully, but it was preparation. And with each small step, I felt the fog lifting, replaced by the clarity of knowing I would not remain silent forever. Lying in bed one night, I heard Mark's soft snores and felt a calm I hadn't known in weeks. The pain was still there, sharp at times, dull at others, but alongside it lived something stronger. I had seen the truth. I had named it, even if only to myself and Denise. And that naming had power. I didn't know yet how I would confront him or when, but I knew one thing with certainty. The days of quiet denial were over. The truth was awake inside me now, and it would not go back to sleep. The quiet acceptance I had been carrying shifted into something else, a steady, deliberate energy that felt almost foreign after weeks of helplessness. It didn't come with rage or tears, but with a calm certainty, the kind that settles into the bones when a decision takes root. I had spent so much time holding my silence that I had almost forgotten what it felt like to move with purpose. Now, with the truth unshakable before me, I began taking my first careful steps toward reclaiming what was mine. The first change was small, but powerful. I stopped answering Mark's questions with automatic ease. When he asked about my day, I gave clipped responses and no longer filled the silence with warmth. He noticed almost immediately, his brow furrowing when I smiled without showing my teeth. "You're different," he remarked one evening as he poured himself a drink. I kept my eyes on the book in my lap and said simply, "I suppose I am." The shift unsettled him, though he tried to laugh it off, and I tucked that reaction away like a card I might need later. Denise was the one who pushed me towards seeking counsel. We met after work at a cafe tucked away from prying eyes, and she leaned in close, her voice steady. "You need someone in your corner, Elena. Someone who knows the law, not just the heart." Her words sat with me until I finally agreed. She gave me the name of a man she trusted, James Holloway, an attorney known for being discreet and exacting. Making that call felt like crossing a threshold, quiet but irreversible. James met me in his office on a gray afternoon. He listened intently as I laid out the pieces, his pen scratching across the page, his expression unreadable but kind. When I finished, he folded his hands. "You've been methodical," he said. "Dates, patterns, observations. That's good. What you need now is documentation that would stand if things become contested: finances, assets, communications. Gather them quietly. Do not confront him yet." His calm tone steadied me, reminding me that my instincts had value. I left with a folder of notes and a strange sense of empowerment humming beneath my skin. Back at home, I began my quiet work. While Mark showered, I slipped through drawers photographing bank statements and bills. While he scrolled on his phone, I organized files on mine, each one a thread in a net I was weaving around him. It wasn't revenge yet, not in the grand dramatic sense, but it was preparation. Each detail I captured felt like a reclaiming of space, a reminder that I wasn't powerless, even if he still thought I was. Mark, meanwhile, continued in his careless patterns. He stayed out later, his excuses thinner, and though he still tried to charm me at times, his efforts landed flat. One evening, he returned from work drinks with the faint scent of Tessa's perfume clinging to his jacket. He draped it over a chair as if nothing were amiss, and I carried it upstairs under the guise of tidying. In my closet, I slipped my phone into the pocket, capturing the evidence in a single, sharp photograph, before placing it back exactly as he'd left it. Lily sensed the tension more than ever, though I tried to shield her. She asked fewer questions now, but her eyes lingered on me with worry when she thought I wasn't looking. One evening, she pressed her hand over mine at dinner and whispered, "I just want you to be okay, Mom." Her words nearly broke me, but I steadied my voice and told her I was stronger than she knew. For her sake, I had to be. The turning point came when I found an email. Mark had left his laptop open on the counter, a rare lapse in his usually guarded habits. I approached slowly, heart pounding, but the subject line was plain to see: weekend plans confirmed. Against every instinct to look away, I clicked. There, in black and white, were details of a getaway with Tessa, dates, hotel reservations, a dinner already booked. My breath caught the betrayal sharper than any whispered conversation or stolen glance. This was no longer suspicion. It was intention written plainly. I closed the laptop gently, my hands steady even as my chest tightened. Later that night, as he kissed me goodnight with feigned tenderness, I stared into the dark and knew my course was set. Quiet observation had carried me this far, but now the first threads of resistance were firmly in place. He thought I was still standing in the background, but I was already moving, already preparing for the moment when the truth would no longer remain hidden. Over the next days, I shifted my routine. I withdrew from him not with anger, but with calm, a quiet distance that he couldn't quite name. When he asked if something was wrong, I answered, "Nothing you'd understand." The vagueness unsettled him, and I saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes. He began checking his phone more nervously, locking his laptop, watching me as if trying to gauge what I knew. That fear was its own kind of victory. I met James again at the end of the week, sliding the new documents across his desk. He studied them with a practiced eye, nodding slowly. "This is enough to begin positioning yourself," he said. But patience will be your greatest tool. Let him believe he holds the power while you quietly build your foundation. His words resonated deeply. As a counselor, I had always taught my students that strength wasn't in the loudest voice, but in the quiet conviction that carries you forward. Now I was learning to live that truth myself. At home, Mark continued to underestimate me, distracted by the illusion of control. He laughed louder, stayed out longer, and carried himself as if nothing could touch him. But I watched with a different kind of clarity now, no longer a wounded wife, but a woman quietly weaving her own path forward. Each day that passed, I felt the balance shift, ever so slightly, the ground beneath me becoming firmer as his arrogance blinded him. The pain was still there, sharp in quiet moments, but it no longer ruled me. Instead, it fueled a new steadiness, a resolve that grew stronger with each passing day. I was no longer waiting for him to confess, no longer hoping for explanations that would never come. I was preparing for the day when silence would end and truth would stand in the open, undeniable. And when that day came, I knew I would not tremble. I would not beg. I would not falter. I would be ready. The weeks of quiet preparation led me to the moment I knew was inevitable. My evidence sat neatly organized, my mind steadied by long nights of planning, yet my heart still raced when the chance to confront them arrived sooner than expected. It happened on a Friday evening when Mark insisted we attend a client dinner at a downtown restaurant. I agreed, though I sensed there was more behind his invitation than business. When we arrived, the room was buzzing with chatter and clinking glasses. I followed him to the reserved table, my steps measured, my smile composed. And there she was, Tessa seated as if she belonged, her gown shimmering in the low light. Mark's eyes flicked to her with a spark he thought he concealed. But I saw it. I always saw it. She rose quickly, embracing him, her perfume wrapping around us like a claim. My pulse steadied. This was no accident. Throughout the evening, I watched their stolen glances, the way his laughter deepened at her smallest comment, the subtle brush of her hand against his sleeve. My silence had sharpened me for this moment. When the waiter poured wine into my glass, I raised it gently and said, "Funny how this feels less like a business dinner and more like a rehearsal for something else." The words landed like a stone in still water ripples spreading through the table. Mark froze, his smile faltering, while Tessa's cheeks flushed a shade too dark. The room around us carried on, oblivious, but at our table the air grew taut. Mark recovered quickly, letting out a forced laugh. "Elena, you're reading into things?" he said, his voice too smooth. I tilted my head slightly, keeping my tone calm. "Am I?" I asked softly. Then with deliberate slowness, I reached into my bag and placed a folded sheet of paper on the table. His eyes darted to it, and I saw the color drain from his face. It wasn't everything just one printout, a copy of the hotel reservation he thought I hadn't seen. He leaned in, his voice low, sharp at the edges. "Where did you get this?" I met his gaze, steady as stone. "The truth has a way of surfacing," I said quietly. "Even when you think you've buried it." Tessa shifted in her seat, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for her glass. She didn't look at me. She looked at him, and in that glance, their shared guilt hung heavy between us. The rest of the evening unfolded like a play unraveling mid-scene. Conversation faltered, laughter thinned, and Mark grew more agitated with every passing minute. I said little, offering polite smiles to the clients, but the truth sat between us like a shadow neither of them could escape. When we finally left, his hand on my arm was too tight, his jaw clenched. "We'll talk at home," he muttered, but I had no intention of letting him control the stage anymore. Back at the house, Lily was upstairs studying. Mark closed the door firmly behind us, his voice rising immediately. "What are you trying to do?" "Elena? Embarrass me in front of clients. Destroy everything I've built." I faced him calmly, my arms crossed. "I didn't destroy anything, Mark. You did that yourself." His face reddened, his anger spilling over into accusations, claims that I was paranoid, insecure, imagining things. Each word was a desperate attempt to twist the story, but I didn't flinch. When he finally fell silent, I walked to the drawer where my folder sat waiting. I placed it on the counter and opened it, spreading out photographs, emails, and notes with quiet precision. His eyes darted over the evidence, his breath catching as the weight of his own actions lay bare before him. "You think this means anything?" he spat. "So what if I was careless? You'll never." He stopped himself, but the words hung unfinished, an admission by omission. In that silence, I spoke evenly. "This isn't about winning an argument, Mark. It's about truth. And the truth is, you've been betraying not only me, but the life we built together." His shoulders sagged slightly, the fight draining from him even as defiance flickered in his eyes. Tessa might have thought she had stolen something of mine, but in that moment I saw clearly what she held was only a hollow shell of a man who had abandoned his own foundation. Later that night, when the house was still, I sat in the living room with the folder spread before me. I didn't weep or rage. I simply breathed steady and deliberate, knowing that the confrontation had stripped away the last of his illusions. He could no longer deny, no longer twist, no longer pretend. I had exposed him without raising my voice, and the silence afterward was louder than any shouting match could have been. The following days were a blur of tension. Mark tried to oscillate between charm and fury, testing which mask might sway me, but none of them found purchase. He accused, then apologized, then accused again. Tessa stopped calling the house, her presence shrinking like a shadow chased by light. Lily sensed the shift, but said nothing, her eyes searching mine for reassurance I could only offer through steady calm. Through it all, I kept moving quietly each step, part of a design only I understood. I met again with James, sharing what had transpired, and he nodded with approval. "You've taken control of the narrative," he said. "Now you hold the advantage." His words steadied me. For years, Mark had commanded the spotlight while I had lived in the supporting shadows. Now the light had shifted. At night, I returned to the quiet of my room, my thoughts circling the path ahead. The confrontation had broken the surface, but the real reckoning still waited. His anger, his denial, his arrogance, those were only the prelude. The collapse of his carefully built facade was near, and I would be there to watch it fall. I knew then that the breaking point was coming not someday, but soon. And when it did, there would be no more shadows, no more silence. There would only be truth, sharp and undeniable, cutting through the life he thought he controlled. The days after the confrontation felt like walking across a bridge I had built plank by plank. Every step was deliberate, every choice measured, and for the first time in years, I felt steadier than the man beside me. Mark tried to regain his footing with a mixture of charm and anger, alternating between hollow apologies and sharp accusations. His desperation showed in the way he lingered too long in doorways, watching me as though he could still convince me that I hadn't seen what I had already exposed. I didn't rise to his bait. Instead, I moved with quiet control, finalizing papers with James, documenting every message and keeping Lily shielded from as much of the tension as I could. She noticed, of course. One evening, she came into the kitchen while I was filing receipts, and asked softly, "Mom, are we going to be okay?" I pulled her into my arms and whispered, "Yes, sweetheart, we're going to be just fine." My voice didn't waver because I knew I was telling her the truth. The unraveling of Mark's world began where he least expected it at work. His company hosted a regional meeting at a hotel downtown, the kind of event where his polished image usually shone brightest. I had no intention of attending, but fate intervened when Denise mentioned that Tessa had been hired to coordinate the evening. The thought of the two of them flaunting their act in public after everything burned in my chest, yet I saw an opportunity in it. Through James's guidance, I had already compiled a careful package, emails, photographs, and a timeline that spoke for itself. He suggested that sometimes the most effective exposure wasn't through confrontation in private, but by simply letting the truth surface where it couldn't be ignored. So when the evening arrived, I dressed simply and walked into that hotel lobby with my head held high. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers, the air filled with laughter and clinking glasses. Mark stood near the stage, his arm brushing too close to Tessa's as she whispered in his ear. He looked like the man he wanted the world to see, confident, admired, untouchable. I approached quietly, every step deliberate until I was close enough for him to notice. His smile faltered when his eyes met mine, but it was too late. I greeted a few colleagues I recognized, slipping envelopes discreetly into their hands. Inside each was a copy of what James and I had prepared. It wasn't dramatic, not a scene of shouting or public spectacle, but a steady unveiling. I saw the shift as they opened the papers, glancing from the pages to Mark with widening eyes. Whispers began to ripple through the room, and for the first time, he wasn't in control of the story. Tessa noticed the change before he did, her face paling as conversation slowed and stares lingered. She leaned in, whispering urgently, but Mark brushed her off, trying to salvage his charm with forced laughter. Yet the air was different now, colleagues pulling back, clients excusing themselves with polite but cool smiles. His facade was cracking in the very place he had always believed himself strongest. I didn't stay long. I left the ballroom before the tension broke into something louder, stepping into the cool night air with a steady breath. I didn't need to see the collapse in full. I knew it had begun. At home, I sat with Walter the following afternoon. He had already heard whispers from friends in town, his expression heavy with sorrow as he looked at me. "I'm sorry it came to this," he said quietly. "But I can't pretend I'm surprised." His honesty cut deep, but there was kindness in it too. He placed his hand over mine and added, "You've shown strength I didn't know you had. Whatever happens next, you'll stand." His faith in me was a balm I hadn't known I needed. Mark returned late that night, the door slamming harder than usual. He stormed into the living room, his face flushed with anger. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he demanded. I met his fury with calm, standing slowly. "What I've done," I answered evenly, "is stop protecting the lies you built." His words tangled in his throat, threats tumbling out but losing their weight against my steadiness. He saw in my eyes that the woman he once counted on for silence was gone. The days that followed were filled with fallout he couldn't contain. Calls from clients stopped, emails went unanswered. Even his closest allies at work began to step back. Tessa's name stopped appearing on his phone, though I knew that had less to do with remorse and more with her self-preservation. She had no reason to anchor herself to a sinking ship. Through it all, I kept moving quietly, securing my finances, ensuring Lily's stability, and leaning on the small circle I trusted. Denise reminded me often that this wasn't just about dismantling his lies, it was about reclaiming my dignity. James stayed steady at every turn, reminding me that patience would carry me further than fury ever could. One evening, I stood at the kitchen sink, the window open to the night air, and felt the stillness settle in. For the first time in months, the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt cleansing. Mark was unraveling before my eyes, not because I shouted or fought, but because I had simply placed truth where it belonged and stepped back. His world was collapsing under its own weight, and I no longer had to carry it. But even as I breathed in that moment of relief, I knew the final step still waited. His humiliation had begun, his power slipping, but closure hadn't yet arrived. That part was still to come, and I would be ready when it did. The final pieces of Mark's downfall didn't come with a crash, but with the steady unraveling of threads he had pulled too far. His company moved him quietly out of his position, colleagues distancing themselves after the truth spread. Tessa withdrew entirely, leaving him with neither a partner nor an ally, and the confidence he once wore like a second skin slipped away in plain sight. Watching it happen, I felt no triumph, only the calm assurance that the balance had finally returned to where it belonged. At home, the air shifted too. The house no longer echoed with his comings and goings, no longer filled with the tension of secrets carried in late at night. Lily walked through the front door after school and found peace waiting for her instead of sharp words or heavy silence. She began to laugh again, louder than I had heard in months, her voice carrying through the rooms like sunlight through open windows. For her, the home became safe again, and for me, it became mine. Walter came by one afternoon with a bag of groceries, his quiet way of showing care. We sat together at the kitchen table, and he reached for my hand. "I never wanted this for you," he said, his eyes heavy with sorrow. I squeezed his hand back and answered gently, "Neither did I. But sometimes, what breaks us clears the way for something better." He nodded slowly, and in his silence, I knew he understood. He had lost his own partner years before, and he recognized that strength often grows in the space grief leaves behind. Denise remained my anchor, reminding me that moving forward wasn't about rushing, but about choosing each step with intention. We met for coffee, talked through the practicalities, and sometimes sat in companionable silence when words weren't needed. James guided the final papers with care, making sure everything was secure and fair. Their presence reminded me that while betrayal can isolate, healing often begins when we let ourselves lean on those who truly stand by us. In the quiet evenings that followed, I began reclaiming the small parts of myself I had set aside for too long. I rearranged the living room, painted the kitchen walls, and bought new sheets for my bed. These weren't grand changes, but each one felt like a declaration. This space is mine. This life is mine. The simple act of placing fresh flowers on the counter one morning filled me with a peace I hadn't felt in years. Looking back, I don't pretend the scars disappeared. Betrayal leaves its mark. And there are nights I still wake remembering the perfume on the stairs or the laughter that didn't belong. But those memories no longer hold power over me. They are reminders of what I survived, not chains binding me to the past. The dignity I thought I had lost was never truly gone. It had only been waiting for me to claim it again. If there is one truth I carry from this, it is that silence has its place. But so does resolve. Love cannot exist without respect, and when respect is gone, holding on is no longer devotion, it is surrender. By choosing to stand even in quiet ways, I found myself again. And in that steadiness, I discovered that justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it arrives in calm steps, in the quiet crumbling of lies, and in the rebuilding of a life rooted in truth. Before we close, I'd love to know what part of this journey touched you the most. Share your thoughts if you feel moved to, and may we all find the strength to reclaim our dignity when life tests us.